Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been working at Arizona's hometown grocers for about 5 years now, specifically in the meat department. Got the job right after finishing my culinary program at the local community college. I originally wanted to be a chef, but the calm routine of precision cuts and helping regular customers actually grew on me. Most of our customers are great, retirees who love sharing recipes, young parents learning to cook, and weekend grillers asking for advice. But then there are the others, the ones who make you question your career choices. This story happened last week during one of our busier afternoons. I was having a pretty good day. Had just finished restocking the premium cuts display when I noticed him walking in. This guy was wearing what I can only describe as the most ridiculous fishing hat I'd ever seen, covered in what looked like hundreds of fishing lures. He was doing this weird inspection routine of our meat cases, dramatically nodding or shaking his head at every item, his eyebrows dancing up and down like they were doing the cha-cha. I barely got out my usual greeting when he cut me off abruptly, demanding a specific piece of meat while pointing at the case. He was jabbing his finger at the glass case like he was trying to break through it. Now let me tell you about what we call meat plinko in the business. It's this fun little game where customers point at meat from weird angles and we have to somehow figure out which exact piece they want. It's especially challenging when you're 6 feet 2 inches and they're pointing from 5 feet 6 inches. The angles just don't match up. I tried asking him to specify which piece he wanted, suggesting the one on the left, but he just got more frustrated. He snapped back, insisting it was right there, and questioned if I was blind. After what felt like forever of him giving directions like higher, lower, more to the left, no your other left, we finally identified the piece he wanted. I grabbed it with my tongs and placed it on the scale, using our standard wax paper underneath and another piece on top, something we always do for hygiene purposes. I weighed it, printed the ticket, wrapped it up, and handed it to him. That's when things got interesting. He started demanding that I do it correctly, dragging out each syllable of the word in an exaggerated way. I must have looked completely baffled because he started getting more agitated. He then started complaining about the extra paper on the scale, accusing me of making it weigh more and demanding that I redo it correctly, still emphasizing that last word in that weird way of his. Now I was about to show him our standard demonstration where we prove the wax paper weighs literally nothing on our precise scales. But then I noticed something. I had actually entered the wrong code in the system. I'd accidentally charged him for New York strip prices instead of the much more expensive filet mignon he'd selected. A smile spread across my face as I realized the perfect opportunity for some malicious compliance. I apologized profusely, acknowledging his point about my terrible mistake and explaining that I had entered the wrong code entirely. I made a show of unwrapping it, removing the offensive extra paper and rewrapping it with the correct code this time. The price jumped from around $15 to $26. He was shocked at the new price, staring at the tag while his face went through the 5 stages of grief in about 3 seconds. Then surprisingly, he let out a defeated chuckle and admitted that he probably deserved that. He paid and walked away significantly less bouncy than when he came in. I had to admire that he took it in stride, though I noticed his fishing hat seemed to droop a little as he left the store. Later that day, one of my co-workers who'd watched the whole thing unfold came up to me shaking his head and laughing. Apparently, this wasn't the first time Mr. Fishing Hat had pulled the do-it-correctly routine in our store. He'd tried it at the deli counter last week and at the bakery the week before that. Guess he finally tried it with the wrong department. He still comes in regularly, but now he's remarkably polite and never questions our weighing procedures. I'm a delivery driver who's been working this job for about 3 years now. Never had any major incidents until last month, when I had what I can only describe as the most insane encounter of my life. I was making my usual rounds in a fairly upscale neighborhood. It was around 2 p.m. and I had just finished delivering a package to one of the houses. When I was walking back to my truck, which was parked properly on the street, I heard the screeching of tires behind me. Before I could even turn around, I felt the most excruciating pain in my right foot. Some woman in a luxury SUV had practically jumped the curb and driven right over my foot. I collapsed immediately, screaming in pain. The driver, who I'll call Karen, jumped out of her car. I expected her to be apologetic or at least concerned. Instead, she started yelling at me, accusing me of trying to scam her and claiming she saw me throw myself at her car. I told her she had just run over my foot and that I needed an ambulance. She just kept ranting, saying this was exactly what scammers like me did, accusing me of targeting innocent drivers to extort money from them. By this point, several people had gathered around us. Two guys who had been jogging nearby came to help me, while a woman who lived in the house I'd just delivered to came running out. The house owner shouted that she had witnessed everything, telling Karen that she had driven onto the sidewalk and hit me. Karen just screamed back at her to mind her own business, insisting that I was obviously working with all of them to scam her. I was in absolute agony, trying to crawl away from her while the joggers attempted to help me up. That's when Karen did something that still makes my blood boil. She walked right up to my clearly injured foot, which was already swelling up inside my work boot, and kicked it as hard as she could. The pain was unreal. I actually blacked out for a few seconds. When I came to, one of the joggers had tackled Karen to the ground, while the other was on the phone with emergency services. The first jogger was yelling for someone to call the police, saying she was completely insane. Karen was screaming that this was assault and demanding to be let go. That's when things went from bad to worse. Karen pulled out a pocket knife and stabbed the jogger who was holding her down. He immediately let go, and she tried to make a run for it. Fortunately, a police car had just turned onto our street, responding to the initial calls. They saw her running with the knife and immediately ordered her to stop. When she kept running, they deployed their taser, and she went down hard. Everything after that was a blur of police officers, paramedics, and statements. My foot had multiple fractures, and I ended up needing surgery. The jogger who got stabbed was rushed to the hospital, but thankfully survived. The knife had missed any vital organs, and he made a full recovery. The entire incident was captured on multiple security cameras from the surrounding houses. Plus, several witnesses had recorded everything on their phones. Karen didn't stand a chance in court. She ended up being sentenced to 12 years in prison. The charges included assault with a deadly weapon, attempted vehicular manslaughter, aggravated assault causing grievous bodily harm, and attempted fleeing from law enforcement. She also got hit with a massive civil lawsuit from both me and the jogger she stabbed. The court also ordered her to pay for all our medical expenses, lost wages, and additional damages. She lost her job at some prestigious law firm, and her license was permanently revoked. I'm back at work now, though I needed 3 months of physical therapy to recover fully. The jogger who got stabbed and I actually became good friends. We meet up for drinks every other weekend and laugh about how we're probably the only people who can say we were victims of a deranged Karen with a pocket knife. I've always been good with computers, especially spreadsheets. In the 90s, my parents bought me my first computer when I was 12, and I spent countless hours learning everything I could about it. While other kids were playing games, I was fascinated by formulas and macros in spreadsheet programs. This weird hobby of mine actually landed me a decent job at a major magazine publisher right after college. My role was supposed to be an editorial assistant, but that changed pretty quickly when they discovered my Excel skills. You see, the management team was absolutely hopeless with spreadsheets. My immediate supervisor, who I had to report to directly, was quite bad. Not only was he technologically challenged, but he was also one of those people who'd rather blame others than admit their own shortcomings. Above him was the department head, who was actually a decent person. He was honest about not understanding technology and appreciated when people helped him out. The problem was that he trusted my supervisor way too much. One morning, about 6 months into my job, my supervisor called me into his office. He told me that I needed to handle the budget spreadsheets for all our magazines. When I asked how many magazines we were talking about, he told me it was 25 magazines, explaining that the previous person who handled them had quit, and they needed someone who knew their way around Excel. I pointed out that it was a lot of work and asked if I'd be getting any additional compensation. He responded with a smug smile I'd grown to hate, telling me this was part of my job now and that I should be grateful for the opportunity to prove myself. I knew arguing would be pointless, so I just nodded and got to work. The budget process was a mess. Each magazine had its own spreadsheet with different formats, and everything had to be manually updated each month. It was taking up almost all of my time, and my supervisor kept taking credit for my work during meetings. One day, after a frustrating meeting where he presented my work as his own, I decided to do something about it. I spent 2 weeks working late, creating an automated system that would handle all the budgets. But I added a little twist, a few lines of code that would ensure any salary increases for my supervisor would never make it to the final version that went to human resources. When I presented the automated system, my supervisor tried to dismiss it. He questioned whether it was complicated and asked if I was sure it was accurate. I explained that it was actually simpler than our current system and offered to show him how it worked. He refused, just telling me to make sure there were no mistakes, adding that he wouldn't take the fall if something went wrong. The beauty of my code was that it was subtle. Every time he or anyone else tried to input a raise for him, the system would automatically revert his salary back to the original amount in the final report. The change would only show up in the human resources copy, while his preview still showed the higher number. For months, he couldn't figure out why his raises weren't being processed. He'd storm around the office, yelling at human resources staff over the phone. I'd hear him shouting through his office door, demanding to know why this was the third time he'd submitted this and why it wasn't going through. Each time, human resources would calmly explain that they were only receiving documents showing his original salary. This went on for about a year, and his frustration grew visibly. He became more aggressive with everyone, not just me. Then came the day that sealed his fate. One of our junior designers had made a minor mistake in some layout. Instead of handling it professionally, my supervisor completely lost it. I was at my desk when I heard the commotion. He was screaming at the designer, calling them an incompetent idiot and threatening to take the cost out of their salary. The designer tried to explain that it was a minor error that had already been fixed, telling him he didn't need to yell. My supervisor got even angrier, telling the designer not to tell him how to do his job. Then came the sound of a scuffle, followed by gasps and screams. My supervisor had actually thrown a punch at the designer. Security was called, and within an hour he was escorted out of the building. The next day, the department head called a meeting. He addressed the incident, telling everyone that yesterday's incident was unacceptable and that my supervisor had been terminated effective immediately. He apologized to everyone who had to witness that, especially to our designer who was assaulted. After the meeting, I quietly removed the code from the budget system. A week later, I was called into the department head's office. He told me he'd been reviewing everything since yesterday and had noticed I'd been doing all the budget work. He asked if I'd be interested in taking over my former supervisor's position, with appropriate compensation, of course. I gratefully accepted the offer. Later, I found out that my former supervisor had been trying to give himself unauthorized raises multiple times throughout the year. The Human Resources Department had documented every attempt, which made for an interesting addition to his termination paperwork. And I still work in publishing today, though at a different company. I've been working at this haunted corn maze for 3 years now, and honestly, it's the best job I've ever had. I initially took it because I was struggling to pay for my college textbooks. Turns out being a theater major isn't cheap, and my parents made it clear they weren't going to support what they called my dramatic phase. Their words, not mine, but jokes on them because my theater background makes me perfect for this job. The pay is decent, but the real perk is getting to scare people for a living. There's something oddly satisfying about making grown men scream like 5-year-olds. Plus, my boss is cool and lets us get creative with our scares as long as we follow the basic safety rules. I usually work the middle section of the maze, which we call the butcher's corner. I dress up as this creepy butcher with a bloody apron and a fake cleaver. The makeup takes about an hour to put on, but it's worth it when you see people's reactions. This one night started like any other. It was mid-October, and the maze was pretty busy. I'd been scaring people for about 4 hours straight, and my voice was getting hoarse from all the creepy laughing and threatening to make some fresh sausages out of the customers. Around 9 p.m., I heard voices approaching my section. It was a father and his son, probably around 12 years old. They were talking pretty loudly, which always makes our job easier since we can time our scares better. I overheard the father dismissively telling his son that nothing in the maze was real, just teenagers in costumes. The son tried to argue back, mentioning how scary the guy with the chainsaw had been, but his father just scoffed and declared that he'd been to much better haunted houses, calling our maze amateur hour. Now, if there's one thing that gets under my skin, it's when people try to act tough and ruin the experience for others. I could tell the kid was genuinely enjoying himself, and his dad was being a total buzzkill. Time to teach him a lesson. I waited until they reached the corner where I usually hide. There's this perfect spot behind some corn stalks where the path turns sharply. I could see them clearly through the gaps in the corn, but they couldn't see me. The dad was still going on about how pathetic everything was when I made my move. I jumped out with my cleaver raised high, letting out my most maniacal laugh, the one I've been perfecting all season. What happened next was pure comedy gold. Both father and son screamed at the exact same time. The dad's voice went up about 3 octaves higher than his previous talking voice. They both stumbled backward and fell right on their butts. As they hit the ground, the dad let out the loudest, longest fart I've ever heard in my life. It must have lasted a good 3 seconds. There was this moment of absolute silence after the fart, where we all just stared at each other. The son looked at his dad, the dad looked at me, and I looked at both of them. Then the son started giggling, which set me off, and finally, even the dad couldn't keep it together. The son could barely speak through his tears of laughter, trying to point out what his dad had just done. The dad, still laughing and struggling to get up, admitted he couldn't believe what had happened. I couldn't resist joining in, using my butcher voice to joke about how that was one way to clear the air. We all lost it again. I had to take off my mask because I was laughing so hard I couldn't breathe. Other guests walking through the maze must have thought we were crazy, seeing a bloody butcher and 2 people sitting in the dirt, absolutely howling with laughter. The best part came after we all finally managed to calm down. The dad actually turned out to be a pretty good sport about the whole thing. While wiping tears from his eyes, he admitted that he took back what he said and agreed the place was definitely worth the money. His son excitedly announced he was going to tell everyone at school about it tomorrow, but the dad quickly protested, insisting that what happens in the corn maze stays in the corn maze. I pointed out that some things tend to escape through other means. That set us off again. They eventually got up and continued through the maze, but I could hear them giggling all the way to the next section. The son kept making little fart noises, and the dad would playfully tell him to knock it off. For the rest of the night, I couldn't keep a straight face during my scares. Every time I jumped out at someone, I'd remember the fart and start giggling, which honestly made some of my scares even creepier. There's something unsettling about a bloody butcher who can't stop laughing to himself. Word got around to the other actors pretty quick, and by the end of the night, everyone was coming up to me asking if the fart scare story was true. The father and son came back the next year, and the dad made a point to find me. He was wearing a t-shirt that said, "Better out than in." His son looked mortified but couldn't stop grinning. They've become regulars now, and every year we recreate the scene for their family photos, minus the fart, of course. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.